Wait, you have a TV?
No. I just like to read the TV guide. Read the TV guide. You don't need a TV.
Television addict! Television addict! Television addict!
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of TV Guidance Counselor, the podcast in which I, your on hiatus Boston stand-up comedian Ken Reid, discuss classic television with my guests using back issues of TV Guide magazine as the gateway into our collective viewing past. This week, slightly different. I'm going through puberty here again. Goddamn puberty allergies. I have two guests, so I recorded them separately and edited them together through the magic of computers. One is a returning guest, Mr. Kliph Nesteroff, who is a genius of classic television. You may know him from his previous book, The Comedians. He has a new book out called We Had a Little Real Estate Problem about Native Americans in comedy, which is a must read. It is excellent. I also highly recommend getting the audiobook because Kliph is one of the best people at reading his own book. It's very, very good. And in addition, I talked to Jon Roberts, who is one of the subjects of the book. Jon is a stand-up comedian from Minnesota. He has a great podcast called NDN, the letters NDN Way, with Johnny R. So definitely listen to that and check his stuff out. So I talked to them both. We kind of covered all the stuff in the book, and it's a fascinating interview, two great guys. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's episode of TV Guidance Counselor with my guests, plural but separate, Kliph Nesteroff and Jon Roberts.
TV is my friend, and it has been always there for me in time of need.
After 5 years and a new book, a little bit different. Last time we were at Musso Frank's. Kliph Nesteroff.
Hey, Ken. Guess what, though? I live like 1.5 blocks from Musso and Frank's. So basically, it's almost the same.
And for the listener, he is chowing down on cream spinach right now.
Ooh, gross. I can't. Was that what I was eating that day? My God. It was a different time, Ken.
It was.
5 years ago. I listened to that again, and I even used the R word in that episode, and I'm like, oh, Jesus. Cut that out.
But I've had people use that recently, although the listener wouldn't know, not you. It is funny because, and we'll talk about the new book in a second because I loved it. But this reminds me, you and I both end up interviewing people from a different era, shall we say?
Sure.
And they certainly, not maliciously, often will use terms that are not cool now.
Yeah.
And since I release like the full audio, I always feel obligated I'm like, I know what you mean, but we're just going to pretend that didn't happen just for your sake.
Yeah. I never had that happen too much. I think mostly because maybe it's, I don't know, maybe this isn't a good excuse, but I feel like show people are a little bit hipper. So the casual racism is not necessarily the same as your average 90-year-old. It's a little bit more. Sometimes you need like a super progressive 90, in show business. But yeah, that does happen sometimes. Jack Carter, when I would interview him, he would have, they weren't prejudices. They were just off the wall ridiculousness. And, I'd be talking to him about MASH. Maybe he'd guest start on MASH or something. And he'd go, yeah. And there was that Jew hater. I go, Jew hater? Who? Jamie Farr. I go, Jamie Farr? He's like the most beloved of all character actors, the nicest guy. He was a Jew hater. What do you mean he was a Jew hater? He was Lebanese. I go, wait, that's not.
Is that a thing? I don't know. Yeah.
To him, that was like the same thing. I go, well, Danny Thomas was Lebanese, and everybody thought he was Jewish. Another Jew hater.
He was a false idol. He was not Jewish. Yeah, I remember. It's this weird thing older people have. Like I used to work in a restaurant, and the woman who was like the cashier was probably 80 years old, and I was waiting to cash out, and I caught the tail end of a conversation she was having with the woman in front of me, and this was the part of the conversation I heard. And she had a mongoloid baby, but she loved it like it was a real baby. And I was like, I get that you're being nice, but that's terrible.
You should read Dale Evans's memoir. You know, Dale Evans, the wife of Roy Rogers.
Yes.
She put out a like a little cheapy paperback biography, I think in the 60s or 70s. I think what's it called? Not Angel. I wanted to call it Angel Unchained, but I think that's a biker movie. Yes. Angel something. Angel something. And it is about her, quote unquote, giving birth to a mongoloid baby. Mm-hmm. And it's the inspirational story of how she didn't want this baby, but decided to keep it. Because after all, a mongoloid, according to Dale Evans, is one of God's children as well. So it's an inspirational book about not suffocating your own child because they don't fit the biblical ideal that you have in your mind.
Is coming from a place of love, but is uncomfortable to hear. Live via satellite from, is it Minnesota?
Yes, Red Lake, Minnesota.
So you might be the first person I've had from Minnesota. Jon Roberts, how are you?
Oh, wow. Good. How are you? Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Good. I mean, and I think you're the first person I've recorded with from Minnesota. So this is a very exciting lockdown day.
I'm honored.
You'll get a plaque in the museum when it finally opens.
I'll put it up by my one of my pictures back here.
What do you got back there?
I actually have got my football helmet for my high school.
Oh, nice.
My tribal flag, Red Lake Nation, the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe on my shirt. And I have art from local artists here.
Oh, cool.
Photography and art. And then this number 15 here, that's the only basketball number that's ever retired in my high school is my late cousin Lester Mo Sumner.
Oh, wow.
And I got some like beaded stuff, Native American beaded stuff. And my in-laws family picture there. And
is this like your little like home museum area, or is it all over your house? Or do you like kind of just like focus in that area?
Yeah, this is just my area, because if I was upstairs, the kids would have everything just scattered all over the place.
Right.
Make sure I'm in a really dark corner of the basement. So if I hear footsteps coming, I turn all the lights off and everything is just pitch black. I'm scared to come in and bother my stuff. So, but yeah,
you have a fail safe if they start to come in.
Yeah, that's if I hear footsteps. How kids have their own what is it, like Gogman or something?
Yeah,
Boogeyman. They have theirs from watching YouTube. I don't know what they see on YouTube, but they think that it lives down here in this part of the basement. So that's fine with me. So that's what I do.
Speaking of Roy Rogers, your book focuses on, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, and I think I told this to you. I'm kind of a nerd for old showbiz and old Hollywood. Nothing compared to your knowledge, but I had no idea that Will Rogers was Native American. No idea.
Yeah, well, most people don't. And if you mention it to a white person, usually the first thing they say, unfortunately, is how much. What percent? This is like an archaic approach to indigenous peoples, which is all too common in the United States. What percent? It would be like if you said Barack Obama's the first black president. Oh, what percentage of
Well, some right-wing hosts have said that.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, we're the most racist people say that. But the most, you would think non-racist or don't think of themselves as anything but progressive type people will still say, well, what percentage, or like 1/16 or 1/12, blood quantum is a controversial thing because the way it was derived in the 1800s was by the white government as a way to marginalize and alleviate themselves of responsibilities as spelled out by treaty. If each succeeding generation is a little bit less Native American, eventually there are no more Native Americans and we no longer have to pay them annuities as spelled out by treaty. So that was the whole reason that percentage of blood thing was devised. So we still have that lingering and really sickening legacy. So when I mentioned Will Rogers, so many people don't think of him as Native American because it's not the first thing that is stated about him, despite the fact we all still know that name, even though we don't necessarily know anything about him. We know Will Rogers, never met a man he didn't like. There's a Will Rogers Hospital, Museum, Park, Beach, Highway, all these things named after
Institute.
Yeah, Will Rogers Motor Court Hotel, all number of things. But who is he? Why is he? What is he? They always called him a great humorist and great wit. And then the example was, he always said, I never met a man I didn't like. And you're like waiting for the funny part to kick in. You're like, what? what the fuck does that even mean?
Yeah,
Like,
I get the setup. Where's the punchline?
Yeah, it doesn't even sound like wisdom. It's just like nothing, like a total nonsense phrase. But there's a reason that phrase became famous. Long after he died, 1952, they issued a commemorative postage stamp of Will Rogers. And that was the quote they put on it, which is just taken out of context, by the way. They couldn't include the whole quote because it didn't fit on the postage stamp. So they just put "never met a man I didn't like." That's why it became famous, was after 1952, almost 20 years after he died. But Will Rogers was Cherokee and never identified as anything other than Cherokee. Never claimed to be white, never pretended to be white. Whenever he wrote or spoke about Native Americans in his newspaper columns in the 1920s or on the radio in the early 30s, or even in a movie of his called So This Is Paris, he always spoke in the collective we or us, we Indians, us Cherokee. And he never wavered from that. And yet that's never focused on because he didn't fit a stereotype. He wore a cowboy hat and didn't wear a headdress as you saw in Western movies. And so for that reason, white people who'd mostly been conditioned by movies in their quote unquote understanding or misunderstanding of what a Native person is, just assumed he must be a white cowboy. And that's how he got sold to the public, as this white not white, but this homespun, simple, all-American cowboy. But
yeah,
if you're born Native American in the 1800s and then become the biggest celebrity on earth, there ain't nothing simple about you. Like, you're super complicated. And that's what I tried to recalibrate in this new book.
Well, growing up early, like before my teens, we only had 3 channels. So we had ABC, NBC, and CBS. And occasionally we'd get a 4th channel, which would be I remember we used to get what is that Georgia one? The not TNT, TBS.
Oh, TBS, yeah, Superstation.
Yes,
TBS.
Superstation, yeah, and that would bring us wrestling every Saturday and Sunday, which was awesome. Because I remember when I was younger, my grandpa used to wake me up at about 11 o'clock on a Friday night to watch AWA wrestling that was filmed down in Minneapolis, I don't know, like a week before. So I got into wrestling a lot and grew up idolizing the Nature Boy Ric Flair because of the NWA and at the time WCW. And so I watched a lot of pro wrestling and then we'd get WPIX in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Watched the Yankees a little bit and Don Mattingly in his prime. And I don't know, I didn't understand the TVs at the time. We get those channels, they leave, and just, eventually we got Fox. And, I grew up without cable television or satellite TV. So I didn't get it till I moved out of my mom's house at 21. So that was my first experience with cable TV. And because a lot of my friends had it and I had no idea what they were talking about. My only thing to the outside world was like Star Magazine, Mad Magazine, and wrestling books. And so
it's so funny that you say that, because so many people that I know that are roughly our age group that got into comedy, they mostly were into wrestling first.
Even when I was younger, we only had one TV, so I never got to watch what I wanted to watch. It was always my grandparents or my mom or my stepdad just had total control of the TV. And it was just the only time I really got to watch TV is like we all like the Dukes of Hazzard, Little House on a Prairie. That was a family thing for us. And so growing up, Dukes of Hazzard was big for me. And I wanted to, once they start banning the General Lee. And
the rebel flag. Yeah, the
rebel flag. And it was just, I don't know. I had to let that go. So my dream is to buy a General or a General Lee, a Dodge Challenger, and then put this flag with on the hood, stars and cross and stars, whatever they call it. So
that's a reboot I'd watch. That's a reboot I would totally watch. It's Dukes of Hazzard, but fully Native American people.
Yes. Yeah,
and the thing I love too about the book and the structure of it is you kind of bounce between sort of contemporary, or a couple years ago, contemporary Native people who are doing comedy and historical stuff, and you kind of go back and forth in sort of each chapter, and it, to me at least, illustrated kind of how little has changed in a lot of the ways, while also drawing a difference between the sort of presentation. But for the most part, you were like, you're talking about Will Rogers in 1890, and then you're talking about someone in 2015, and they're kind of having to approach things in a similar way.
Well, culture has never really adapted or altered the indigenous stereotypes that are prevalent everywhere. Where it did adjust and recalibrate a lot of the Black stereotypes, a lot of the Latino stereotypes, but not the Native American stereotypes, with the exception of switching from one stereotype to another. So pre-60s or even pre-50s, the stereotype was always as the villain, the savage.
Yeah.
The bloodthirsty Western movie villain. That was the predominant Native American stereotype in popular culture. Then after World War II, and then especially after the late 60s, it became this overly passive, all-knowing, spiritual, communicating with nature, never smiling, staring off into the abyss while a pan flute willows in the background. That became the new stereotype. And that kind of continues to today, whether it's an episode of Saved by the Bell or Dances with Wolves, today. Because
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Yeah, Saved by the Bell. Or like Poltergeist 2, I always think of.
I don't remember Poltergeist 2. I did see it on TBS when I was a teenager, but I have very little recollection.
They expand because people forget that movie. That's the classic where they're like, you've built your house on an Indian burial ground, which actually isn't the plot of Poltergeist. Yeah. But they weirdly pretend like it was in part 2. And the hero, or not even the hero, he's like their Deus Ex Machina, is this like shaman medicine man who comes in with his good magic to defeat the bad magic. And it's like,
yeah,
I think you people think you're doing this is better, but it kind of isn't.
Yeah, that type of thing, it exists. It still exists to this day. It was in the Simpsons movie. There was like a shaman character, and there was the Adam Sandler movie Ridiculous Six in 2015, which basically kind of resurrected the F Troop conceit. So we wouldn't do blackface today, obviously, and we wouldn't showcase any number of other stereotypes. But with Native Americans, it always seems to be fair game, and it's in part because people have been so conditioned and so brainwashed to dehumanize Indigenous peoples that they're not even treated as people by popular culture. They're treated as mascots, as cartoon characters, as stereotypes. If you complain about it, you're a wet blanket. Like, where's your sense of humor? Whereas if somebody said, well, this is racist because it features Mickey Rooney as a landlord in Breakfast at Tiffany's, or everybody would be like, yeah, that's crazy. That's racist. And yet for some reason, it's taken so long for non-natives to acknowledge the humanity of Indigenous peoples. I think it's starting to round the bend and turn a corner right now. In fact, just today, the day that we're recording, NBC released a trailer for a new sitcom that's coming out on NBC Peacock called Rutherford Falls with Ed Helms. Ed Helms plays the descendant of like a racist founder of a town, and they're going to get rid of the statue because the Indigenous population is objecting to, it's based on more or less based on what could happen in real life. Anyways, that sitcom has a predominantly Indigenous cast and a predominantly Indigenous writer's room. The first major American sitcom to do so. That's coming out soon. And I think that we're maybe starting to round a corner. Maybe this younger generation is a little bit more intelligent and can see the deficiencies in how we've been taught about Indigenous peoples over generations.
I was thinking about it when I was reading the book, and it was interesting to me because I always think of like, people talk about like America's original sin, and it's always slavery, which is terrible. But there was kind of one before that.
Yeah.
Where we kind of and it never gets spoken of in the same way, which is one part of it. And the other part of it, when I see that, other minorities or subcultures that have been able to advocate for themselves to not be presented in these cartoonish ways, part of it is, I think that we've never had Native American culture be marketed successfully to white kids who want to be cool with it. Whereas I think most other things we had, like, there didn't seem to be money to be made in it. You couldn't say, all these kids are listening to this kind of music. We'll concede to making you a human being in this. Or it seemed like there was never a way for media to make money off not having them be stereotypes. I may not explain that well.
No, I understand what you're saying. I don't know that they ever attempted to, though. I'm sure there would have been money to be made, or could be money to be made, but nobody bothers.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Like in the past 20 years, there've been so many different indigenous like hip hop groups and things like that. It's not. Every native culture is different. So we say Native American culture. It doesn't really mean anything because
hundreds of
different languages and backstories and specific beliefs, and many which contradict each other and are not the same at all. In the late 60s, it became a trend with white hippies to sort of wear so-called Native American inspired attire. And, you were considered hip if you believed in this recalibration of American history, rejected the old history books, and started to read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown and things like that. So it did sort of enter into popular culture, but it just created like a secondary stereotype. And most people, like even people who were very sympathetic with different political movements like Jane Fonda, they still had a very cursory understanding. And I think all non-natives have a very cursory understanding. Even those who are sympathetic still fall into stereotypes or do racist things or take ownership or, this is what I'm trying not to do right now. There's no native guest on this podcast, not speak on behalf of anybody, and instead providing the platform for native peoples to speak for themselves, which is what white liberals generally do. Like if you watch Jane Fonda or Marlon Brando on the Dick Cavett show in the early 70s, they're talking about indigenous issues, and then they'll have a indigenous guest there sort of sitting quietly
saying nothing.
But I mean, at the same time, in those days especially, and maybe still today, it's like the media doesn't pay attention to native issues unless there's this white spokesperson where all the cameras can descend on them, whether it's Mark Ruffalo or in those days Marlon Brando. And so in a way, it was like a double-edged thing. A lot of native activists were grateful for Marlon Brando's participation because it did bring the cameras, it did bring the newspapers. And so native issues that they'd been talking about for generations are finally getting some coverage. So in a way, it had this beneficial thing. But ideally, you would get that without Marlon Brando.
Right. So,
and there's all kinds of complicated angles about it.
It also, recalling how people talk about that, specifically that Dick Cavett interview and then the Oscars thing, it was, again, almost a double-edged sword because people were like, there's Brando with his Looney Tunes things he's into. And it seemed to bring, some cameras to it, but also sort of took on some of the Brando baggage too, in a weird way, which probably didn't help.
Yeah, no. And when we look back on some of the political social movements of the late 60s and the early 70s, we think of that as this incredible era of like minority activism and marginalized people asserting themselves in a major way for the first time in a long time, whether it was the AIM movement, women's liberation, gay liberation, what they called at the time, Chicano power, Black power movement, all happening at the same time, but at the same time, and including the anti-war movement, the hippie movement. But when we look back at it now, a lot of it was like very misogynistic. Like it was still like the hippies made the hippie women do the cooking and the cleaning while they did the political scheming, and the microphones always gravitated towards people like Dennis Banks and Russell Means, but there were all these indigenous women involved who kind of got shoved to the margins. So there's even been a recalibration of thinking about those social movements today, about how progressive were they, or were they just like a minor step on the way to full equality or what have you. I mean, these are not simple issues, especially when, you're a person like me, I'm a white, sometimes straight male, and you do not want to be speaking on anybody's behalf. But at the same time, with a platform, it would be nice to use it to try and elevate certain voices. And so in this book, when people read it, they'll see that in any instance where I'm talking about a contemporary person who's alive, a comedian, I just kind of give them the space to speak for themselves without any editorial comment from yours truly. But with Will Rogers and stuff from the past, then my voice is more present.
Yeah, that was the big difference I noticed between this and the last book, which did have more of your, not even editorializing, but sort of commentary or framing of a lot of the historical stuff. Like your voice is in that book a little more than in this one, which is more, it's more like a journalistic piece than a sort of narrative, comparatively, which I don't think is a bad thing. It fits with this topic.
Yeah.
Which was that hard for you to pull yourself out of it that way, because you're a passionate enthusiast for these things?
No, it wasn't difficult. It was easier because you just record what people say and then you put it down. And that's all there is to
It's
it.
like those oral history books.
Part of it is largely oral history, this book. I don't frame it that way, but that's basically what it is. There's a chapter about Jackie Klee, and she just talks for 2 pages. There's a section about Ryan McMahon, and he just talks for 2 pages, So that was easier.
Eddie Murphy, Dennis Wolfberg, and the John Campanera, is that his name?
Yeah.
Do the Harry Carey impression, and then Drew Carey, and all those guys. A lot of people never like Emo Phillips and all that.
Oh yeah, Emo's great. So
I was a kid watching all that, and my mom was wondering, why are you? You're not even old enough to watch this. You're all into it. Well, actually, my my stepdad, he was into he loved comedy. George Carlin, and who was it? Idol, Eric Idle, his true.
Or Eric Idle from Monty Python.
Monty Python, yeah. I remember he was trying to get me into that. I just couldn't get it though. But everything else was just Eddie Murphy and Carlin and all that stuff. And my first real experience with comedy was Eddie Murphy's. Well, at the time it was a cassette, and it was called Eddie Murphy Comedian. Apparently it was Delirious on VHS or whatever. And then, so I was listening to that at 8, 9 years old. No business.
Totally appropriate.
Me and my sisters would put that in the tape player, and my parents went, and then we were just, listening to it. And, I got ice cream and all that stuff. We knew all them jokes. And it was just, now that I watch it again, in my 40s, I wouldn't let my son watch that right now. At that age, I was like, what? I don't know if we were tougher or what it was, but it didn't phase us. It was just growing up that way. That's how people talked.
Yeah.
When you read the book in its totality, a lot of people contradict each other, or they have different points of view that do not gel with the other person's point of view. And I don't interject and compare. I just, again, I want it to be understood to non-natives that there's no giant sort of, there's no one spokesperson, and people are not of one mind or thought, that everybody's coming from a different place, different background, different belief system. Some people are, religious, some people are not, some people live in big cities, some people live in a rural area, and some people speak their native language, some people don't, some people speak a different language. It's just, there's a lot of nuances in indigenous cultures that are not acknowledged. It's not just like Native American is one
right
thing, it's hundreds of different things. And I think that comes through in this book as you read the words of each individual comedian. But I didn't find it hard to subtract myself from the situation. I do find it harder now in promoting the book, because you're trying to promote a book, your name's on the spine of the book, but at the same time, you want to not be like taking credit for anything,
right,
or overshadowing other people that you're trying to elevate, so that has been a lot trickier.
Yeah, because knowing you certainly have strong opinions about stuff and aren't afraid to share them, and they're well informed. And yeah, for me that would be difficult to not to have to check myself so that I'm not editorializing on someone's behalf or something like that.
It's not even about my opinions. It's more just about I like attention, right? Well, seriously, as a former comic, and so when the book gets written up in the New York Times or the Hollywood Reporter, or it's like a big deal for me. Like,
totally.
Writing in solitude for 2 years, and then a pandemic for 3 years, I've been in lockdown. Well, everybody else has been in lockdown for 1. So the chance to then get attention from the press and the media is like a big deal for me. But at the same time, I don't want to be gloating like, I am the best, I am the greatest. And it's supposed to be a book about
Right. Look what I've done for you. Yeah.
And there are people who do that. They call it white savior complex.
Yeah.
And I do not want to be exemplifying that in any fucking way.
So we'll talk about TV in a moment, because I gave you a couple late 50s, early 60s issues here because we were talking about representation.
Yeah.
But the other thing that hit me was, obviously there's a big generational divide. And to your point about them not being, there's not a sort of hive mind among a culture. One of the things that sticks out in this book as well is there's a true generational difference in outlook of, I wouldn't even call them the first wave, but that sort of first group of native comedians and the current people, and some of the differences in look is. Well,
I mean, it's like any other artistic progression. We'll just use comedy as an example. You and I grew up in the 1980s. We watched stand-up comedians in the 1980s, probably loved a lot of what now would be considered kind of hokey or corny or hacky stand-up comedy. And we enjoyed it and we watched it and we loved it. Airline food, the cliches of shoulder pads and rolled up sleeves and skinny ties, all of those cliches, Jack Nicholson impressions. Yeah, they're easy to malign and ridicule today. But because of those comedians in the 80s, then we had the comedians that came along in the 90s who were alternative and kind of deconstructed that and ridiculed that. And then subsequently a new comedy boom in the era of podcasts and Netflix that, again, stands on the shoulders of those who came before. So in indigenous comedy, it was the same thing. There was a lot of what today native comedians themselves would consider sort of hacky material. And there were certain cultural references, so-called cultural references that were that are considered hackneyed. So like res cars, broken down res cars, res dogs, fry bread, snagging. These were certain topics that on reservations, every comedian or humorist referenced and got laughs with. But now there's a new generation and they want to get away from that because they feel it is too easy. It's the equivalent of airline food. It's the equivalent of a Jack Nicholson impression. But at the same time, it served a purpose when there weren't a lot of indigenous comedians around. It was a way not just to get your foot in the door, but also it was sort of like a way to identify with a humorist. Here's somebody who's speaking from, a reservation experience or whatever. So there was a generational difference. And so today, where there's still a few of those comedians that are stragglers hanging on with that sort of, I'm going to do jokes about res cars and res dogs and things like that. They're sort of derided a little bit. And I think I know what you're getting at, because there's one comedian in the book specifically where there's a chapter that's sort of gossipy about a comic named, well, I don't even really want to say his name.
Yeah, people can read it. It's a fascinating section, but weirdly that section of the book was the thing I could relate to the most, because it was the most, like, to your point, like, it's in everything.
Yeah.
We all have that same generational thing, which is really universal, regardless of the sort of details of it.
Yeah, this guy who's like a comedian, he's a square, he's got to get with the times, but he refuses to get with the times. This is what I do. It's funny. Right. It's always worked. But a new generation is saying, yeah, maybe, but what you're doing is causing greater harm now. It's stereotypical, it's hacky, it sends the wrong message. And you hear that, a variation of that debate in stand-up comedy today. Unfortunately, like week after week after week, this sort of culture war that is probably partially fabricated, but also at the same time indicative of every single generation.
A lot of everybody's doing their comedy. All the natives are doing comedy, have their own stories of growing up on a reservation. A lot of them are traditional and learn their language, and some of us aren't. So it's just hearing our stories. Once we get this big microphone, like trying to get our in the book. A lot of people will probably be shocked about how the native communities have been so oppressed. We're still out talking. We're still being loud about it, and we won't stop. And it's just pretty inspiring. Even myself, I was inspired to read a lot of the stories in the book. I've also been doing a a documentary on Native comedians, which I'm still trying to get into the editing process. 5 years in now, hopefully I have it ready for Sundance. But hearing everybody's story is different, but yet we're all still headed towards the same goal to, it's pretty much us educating people that have no idea what's happening with us. Hopefully we're like a watchman for comedy.
Yeah. And the other thing is too, it's not like there's
a lot of them have a really, we'll call it a thick res accent, and it's just the way we talk. You probably hear my accent right now. It's really, being up north, it's really kind of, I try to suppress it, but there's just sometimes it's just I can't do it anyway. Just what I am.
Me and my Boston accent.
Yeah. I was gonna come and do a Boston accent too. Like the Jimmy Fallon on SNL, but
yeah.
That's probably a little offensive. I better not, man.
I mean, people from Boston are going to be offended no matter what you say to them, so you might as well go all in.
That's the thing about I learned stuff about Boston through movies, and I just realized who was it? I know Bill Simmons, the sports guy.
Yep.
I used to read a lot of his columns, and once he quit writing, I kind of lost interest in him. But a lot of what I know about Boston is through him, and then Bill Burr.
Yep.
And Joe Rogan. I realized that Boston isn't really for non-whites. What is it like that? I can't remember what it was. But yeah, it's just I thought everything was all fine, and start comedy in Boston. It'll be fun, but it's not. It wasn't at the time. And
in the 50s, the post-war period, when blackface was no longer common and it was out of favor, and they weren't using or doing it on TV in the 50s, there was a whole contingent of old, elderly, like minstrel performers who were like defending themselves and their livelihood, saying, "I'm an entertainer. This is how we always do it. How dare you? You're trying to take a bite out of my livelihood. We never hurt anybody. We're the foundations of show business." And other people were saying like, "No, what you do is racist." Like in the 50s, this debate. Yeah. This wasn't like on the Joe Rogan podcast. This was like 1955, 56, 57, 58. These debates were raging. And if you study the history of show business, it was true. Yeah, there's an example in this new book. In 1911, a contingent of indigenous leaders met with President William Howard Taft to lodge a formal complaint about the racist depictions and malicious distortion of history that they were seeing in silent Western movies. In the year 1911, 3 years before Charlie Chaplin even becomes famous, 4 years before D.W. Griffith becomes, this major filmmaker. So right from the beginning, Native peoples were complaining about the racist stereotypes being fed people by cinema. And those complaints continue to this day.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, we, like you and I in our generation, be like, look at these rubes as kids watching cowboy and Indian westerns, in the 50s and 60s. No wonder they have these thoughts. But when I was thinking about it, I'm like, growing up, we had, Apache Chief on the Super Friends and Hanna-Barbera making Paw Paw Bears, and these, which is the same thing. It's just, we kind of felt a little more enlightened,
I mean, I don't know that it felt that much more light if you were a Native person, because it was still like total insult. And you see it all the time, like just the casual racism. Like I watched a Perry Mason movie the other day, and they open up this coffin and there's a cigar store, a statue in the coffin. And then they start making all these puns. It has nothing to do with the plot. It's just like a thing. When you start to look for it, or not even look for it, when you just become a little bit more self-aware about those types of stereotypes, you just see them nonstop in American popular culture. And that's what indigenous peoples who are aware of it every day of their lives are faced with every time they turn on the TV or a sporting event or an old song or anything. It's like relentless. It's more than any other minority. Indigenous peoples are maligned by popular culture.
The thing about the Native community, it's like if one breaks through, they're going to break the wall for everybody else to come through. And it's just a matter of time before, a lot of us are out there, being heard. And it's like, the the whole history of how the Native Americans were treated by the government as they wanted to, hush it. Yeah, we treated them bad. We're sorry. Just let's do
Move
this.
on. Come on.
Let's move on. But we are going to be able to tell our story to a wider audience, and then it's going to make this country, look like what they deserve, because we're not treated the best for 500 years, and it's just it's our time to shine, and we're not going to be shy about our storytelling.
Is there anything you saw growing up that was, because we were talking a lot about just the ridiculous stereotypes and the way that Native people are presented in television and movies for decades and decades and decades.
Growing up, my grandpa, he watched a lot of Westerns, so we got the Lone Ranger, Rawhide, and the Big Valley and all that stuff. And it was rare for them to have natives in their show, but when they did, of course, it was a white man, except for Jay Silverheels. Jay Silverheels was probably the first native to really get some screen time. But I think being that Jay Silverheels was the first one we saw, we figured, maybe the white man is trying to, be nice to us. And so that was my thinking. None of that really bothered me growing up. And, the cartoons, now that I look back, are pretty ridiculous. And just the way I grew up, I suppose I had the belief that nobody was mocking me because, we're all trying to watch us be entertained. And now that I think about it, it was some pretty terrible interpretations.
And the knee-jerk response when you're non-native is like, oh, have a sense of humor, lighten up. But when it comes to any other minority, that's not necessarily the same attitude. Like so-called progressive people themselves are frequently ignorant and guilty of perpetuating or buying into this legacy of stereotypes.
Well, I even think of to sort of what we were talking about before, where even if someone's trying to be sympathetic and not malicious, they could be doing just as much damage. And one of the things I thought about is that Seinfeld episode where Jerry's dating a Native American woman and there's the cigar store and stuff. But I think they thought they're making jokes at the expense of people making those kinds of jokes.
Sure.
But it doesn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's still written by a bunch of white comedy writers who don't know any indigenous people, probably. I think was it a Native actress who played that character? I think it may have been, but
I think it was.
It was a funny episode. You cannot really expect the sitcom world, especially in that era, to get anything right.
Even though I was just a kid, I watched a lot of that Thursday night NBC, Cosby, Cheers, and Mad About You, the weirdest shows for a Native kid to watch, man.
Yeah.
I was watching reruns, a couple of years ago. I was watching Mad About You, and my wife was like, "What are you watching?" I don't know. And then she said, "You and your old man, weird shows." It's like, I don't know. I just like something about, I don't know, that was set in New York, right?
Yeah.
Something about New York City. I want to go there, walk the streets, middle of the night, because everything is always, it's probably not like that now, but it's
it is, well, not right now, but in general it is. You've never been to New York?
Never been to New York.
You've been to LA though.
LA, yes.
Yep, because you went to, how did that feel? Did it live up to what you thought it would be like based on movies and TV?
It did not at all. It was dirty, it was crowded, the traffic was horrible, and it was just living up in the woods. It wasn't for me.
Maybe you won't like New York.
My cousin is living there. He's been trying to get me to move down there with my kids. Like, no, man, I can't live in this crowded city. It's not me.
I mean, having grown up here, which is a dirty, crowded city, like LA seems like an oasis. I'm like, oh, it's so nice and the weather's nice, but yeah, New York's a whole different vibe. But Mad About You and Seinfeld are so New York-y. And Mad About You is one of those shows that I always think is one of the most underrated shows of the 90s, because it's just character. It's just dialogue and character, and it's funny. News Radio I love as well in that way. Even Spin City is a great show. But to your point, what else were you gonna watch at that time?
Yeah.
I mean, I have not really seen in America. I'm trying to think of like an example of a TV show that had like some sort of indigenous themed episode or plot line that really nailed it. And they don't. There's a native actor from Texas. I forget his name, but he was a regular on King of the Hill and Parks and Recreation, playing a native character. And there's some funny stuff in those episodes that he does. But at the same time, he's still often in King of the Hill has like this sort of all-knowing spiritual, you know, there's a sexualization aspect, which is also sometimes controversial. And then in Parks and Rec, it's usually about casinos, which is like the new stereotype is always casinos and casino references and questions about casinos. White person meets a Native American for the first time, they start asking them about casinos. You know, it's just like this. There's all these sort of new cliches and new tropes. It's very rare that an indigenous person is cast to be a human being, you know, with their shirt on, wearing pants, just playing video games and, you know, working their Joe job. That almost never happens in American television. It took a long time for us to get there with Asian characters and Black characters as well. You know, you go back and watch any TV show right up until maybe Jack Sue and Barney Miller. And anytime an Asian actor enters the scene, they play that fucking music.
Yep. And a gong.
Yeah, a gong or whatever. And so it took a long time to get beyond that.
But even then, you had Jack Sue and Barney Miller started, 73, 74? And we didn't get an all-Asian sitcom till All American Girl in 95, and that was horrific.
Yeah, again, I mean, one of the keys is you have to have the minorities that are being presented on the screen have to be involved behind the camera, because otherwise it's just this white concept of what something is that they know nothing about. And so that's what happened with All American Girl, and has continued to happen for so long. So when Hollywood talks about diversity, it can't just be a token casting or a remake of some old movie with an all-black cast. You have to have people on the production side, on the creation side, on the direction side, on the writing side, on the makeup side, who are also identifying with that same given minority. Otherwise, the results are going to be mixed at best and ignorant at worst.
Growing up, I didn't know we were poor because we never went without. You know, we always had what we needed. And traveling on big vacations was never a big issue for us. You know, we go down to Minneapolis to visit family. That was the extent of our traveling. And it was just something that we never really thought about, you know, until I start getting older and I start seeing my friends go on vacation. Like, why are they going? What is that? You know, you see vacations on TV. You don't think people where I'm from go on vacation.
That's sci-fi.
Yeah, that's unreal. Why would you do that? But yeah, it was just when I played baseball, you know, Little League baseball, my uncle was the coach. He took us to a Twins game in 1985. We saw Reggie Jackson, Rod Carew, Kirby Puckett, and there were like a couple other legends that because they were playing the Angels, and I think it was 85, year before the Angels went to the World Series. And that was big for me because I love baseball. You know, my grandpa grew up. I grew up watching the Cubs because it's what he watched. You know, we eventually got WGN with our channels, and because we didn't have Twins games up here for some reason, but we just watched the Cubs, and just going to a real baseball game was a big thing for me. You know, that's the only way I got to travel was with my baseball team, and you know, do cool things was with sports and stuff like that. One of the things that I remember growing up, there was this ventriloquist puppet guy named Buddy Bigmountain. He came to the reservation and he performed at the elementary school. We had a stage where we did our, you know, Christmas plays, and he was there doing his act, and the whole gym was full. It seemed like everybody from Red Lake was there. The place was packed, and he was doing his dance, you know, doing his acting. And that's one of the first things I really like, man, I've never, you know, watching Eddie Murphy and all that, and I've never seen a native get up there and make people laugh. You know, you see it around the house. My Uncle Joe is probably the funniest guy I've ever known, but he was never up in front of a big audience like that. And that was the first time I really, you know, saw that. You know, everybody was already talking about Charlie Hill, but I was just a kid, and you know, 3 channels. We're not going to see Charlie Hill on my TV way up in Red Lake, Minnesota. You know.
Yeah, like even I, as sort of a stand-up comedy nerd who was just trying to absorb every single thing I possibly could. Like I didn't even really see much Charlie Hill, and he was easily the most high-profile, if not the only, native comedian at that time. So it wasn't easy to find necessarily, even if you were looking for it. But it took a guy coming to you in person to kind of make you realize, oh, maybe I could do that.
Yeah, it was. We have these cultural celebrations called powwows and stuff. There we have MCs. They're the funny ones that keep the thing going, and jokes, teasing people. That's the closest I've seen to up to that point, seeing somebody entertain a big crowd like that. But to see somebody all alone on a stage, getting all that attention and all that, them bringing them laughs, that was eye-opening for me. And I always have to credit Buddy Bigmountain for pushing me in that direction to try and get to that point in life. And I'm still working at it, and hopefully get there like he did.
It's a weird time. I mean, I still call myself a stand-up comedian, even though I haven't been on stage in over a year, which is the longest I've gone since I was like 15. So it's a weird time. But have you looked up Buddy Bigmountain to see what became of him?
I see a lot of excuse me. People when they go to Vegas, he's doing the street shows. I think it's on Fremont Street. So hopefully I can make it out there and just share with him, what he meant to me, pushing me towards comedy. And that's one of the things that I'd really like to do. So
yeah, I'm sure that would make that guy's day. Like you, as you know, as a performer, we always only focus on like the one person who didn't like what you were doing.
Yeah.
So whenever someone tells you a nice thing, you're like, really? Oh, wow. Yeah. So were there, when you started going out and doing stand-up, you're doing these long drives, you got to go to open mics. There's kind of nothing near where you are, so you have to kind of really travel to go there. And I imagine on a lot of these bills or open mics or shows, you're again probably the only Native person on the show.
Well, actually, in Minneapolis, there's maybe a couple, 2, 3 at the most, and it took me, a few times to get up, get to Minneapolis, and I'd come across them. And then, they're like, what? They see me, you're from Red Lake, everybody, I don't know, something about Red Lake. You're from Red Lake. Everybody knows Red Lake. But yeah, maybe the second comedian that's ever come from Red Lake. And with those two, I know it's Will Spotted Bear and Trish Cook, who's also from Red Lake. And I didn't know she was a comedian until I met her at an open mic down there. And it really is rare for Native comedians to be in Minneapolis, even though a lot of the it's a huge population of Natives down in Minneapolis, and not a lot of them are performing comedy. So it's just it was amazing to meet fellow Natives trying to do comedy down there, and
do you think
contact with them?
A lot of people just didn't gravitate towards comedy because, I mean, everybody has funny people, regardless of the people you come from. To your point, your uncle was the funniest guy, and my same thing. But why don't you think they were? There's only a couple of you down there, even though there's a big population. Do you think it's because you just didn't see anyone? They didn't have a Billy Big Mouth, doing the show, or Bigmountain or whatever.
Yeah, it's more of a, my friends, the guys I grew up with, they're all hilarious. We used to do video projects early, when I first started doing this in 2006, and hilarious guys, all the way through school. We laughed, we had plans to make something, we made a DVD, and things just fell apart. And just everybody, there's a lot of people in Red Lake that are hilarious, but I don't know what it is, just being secluded here. A lot of our people are not really bold in trying to, make noise in other ways. Right now, I'm still thinking that my choice to go into comedy isn't really something our people don't approve of, because it's like, I feel like that little kid at home, you want him to sit, or a relative, you want to come out when company comes because of what he's going to say. That's what I feel like. And I don't get a lot of, not a lot of support around here because of my opinions and my tools I have to, get to the outside world. And it's just a lot of people don't want to rub people the wrong way around here or even out there being a native. And it's just a lot of our people aren't really, outgoing, even though they are funny with each other, families and stuff. And it's really hard to explain, it's just something about living up here, secluded, one of those things.
Do you think it's like, hey, don't make waves. Everything's great here in our kind of world. You're going out and you're going to make a scene or people will come and ruin what we got going on. Not that you'll ruin it, but you know what I mean? Where it's like kind of stay under the radar or like, don't make waves. Everything's kind of cool. Be cool, man.
No, I don't think it's that. It's just our, we're kind of, I suppose, we're brought up a certain way where if, maybe there's some truth to that too, because a lot of our people don't really, it just growing up around here, white communities surrounded us and we don't realize racism is a big factor because we've grown up in it and it's just the way people treat us. It just, I've had a cousin come back to Red Lake and he told me, man, how do you guys put up with, going to there's a local town here we all shop at. They're so horrible to it. That's just how it is for us. And we just don't really let it affect us. But, now that there's social media and everybody's sharing their story and it's come to a point now where one of these days we're gonna have enough, and our money supports that local economy down there. And if we leave, which one of our tribal chairmen actually did before, boycotted that town, and they really suffered with us taking our money elsewhere. So we do have that power, and one of these days we just might pull that again and show them what's up.
Yeah, they'll learn. But that it's sort of the thing where it's like, look, they're gonna treat us like shit anyway. So don't go poking them, kind of thing. I wonder if that's sort of a little bit of the mentality. But it fascinates me that you have talented, funny people with an amazing culture and even just regionally so different, and you're sort of just not forced, but you're just kind of like, we're just keeping it to ourselves.
Yeah. That's pretty much what it is. Yeah. We just keep what we have here and we'll just deal with it when it comes along. But, me, I'm just, I don't want to say I'm different, but I see things a certain way and, speak on things maybe I shouldn't sometimes. And it just,
some of us are just wired differently.
Yeah. We're just, we'll see what happens, you know?
But do you see it changing at all? Like, are people, now that obviously people don't have 3 channels and there is sort of almost everything at everybody's fingertips if you want it or what to look for, are you seeing people's attitudes changing, or are they consuming stuff differently that people
they have more of a look into the outside world that we never really had before. And, a lot of people are starting to realize what's possible now, getting up, moving off the reservation, coming back to help the people. And it just, a lot of people are doing that now. And it's, I feel like it's going to change because, I've worked in child protection and I worked with kids, and I could see a little bit of the tide turning, just a slight bit, it's just, we are going to make some moves here pretty soon, and it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, because it doesn't matter if you're like, whoa, we tried, because the result is the result. And when you detail an I Love Lucy episode in the book, and it's painfully unfunny, but it's evident that they thought they were turning the tables on Lucy, kind of making her look like she was dumb with the jokes, but it doesn't come across that way. And it made me think of that Seinfeld episode. Like, they're not that different.
Yeah. You're still playing on all of the stereotypes. So I haven't watched that Seinfeld episode recently, but I remember one of the jokes is about quote unquote an Indian giver or an Indian giving thing. And so often when there's any native themed anything, it immediately the jokes are based on those cliches. the Indian Giver or
Scalper is in
Scalper,
it.
Tomahawk
Yeah.
Chop, blah, blah, blah. It's always the same fucking horse shit. And it has really never changed. I think it's going to change this year. There's a TV show coming out on FX this year called Reservation Dogs. It's Sterling Harjo, one of the comedians that's profiled in my book, co-created it with the guy who made Jojo Rabbit. It looks really good. Like I said, there's this show on NBC called Rutherford Falls. And then I think there's a children's show on Netflix, like an animated show from an indigenous creator and has a native cast and stuff like that. So 3 shows in 1 year on American TV, that's a big deal. Washington changed the name of their football team. Cleveland changed the name of their baseball team. In some small way, I feel like this book maybe is a piece of that same puzzle. A lot of things have changed since Standing Rock happened in 2016. Things have started to percolate more. I'm from Canada, and their First Nations issues are a lot more prominent in the news. There's a lot more Native faces on TV. And when I moved to Hollywood, it was evident that all of that was pretty much absent here. And I always thought that was sort of like unconscionable. I was like, this is Hollywood where everybody is saying inclusivity and diversity, and yet it just doesn't bode true when it comes to, in my opinion, when it comes to representation of indigenous people. So
I wonder if some of that is because in a lot of ways modern Hollywood was built on Westerns. It's a major pillar, that there was sort of we don't want to poke that giant because we're really complicit as an industry more than maybe anything else in purveying these.
I don't think Hollywood is thinking that deeply. I think you're giving Hollywood,
or more like we're afraid that we'll get yelled at for what we did.
I don't think so. I think that it's just plain ignorance. Just doesn't even register. It doesn't even hit the radar. The idea of casting native actors in native roles or coming up with indigenous storylines or including, I just don't think it registers. Native peoples have been so successfully dehumanized over the generations by popular culture, by the government, by the military that, that's how you train soldiers in war. How do you convince somebody to kill another person on your orders? Well, you have to first convince them that the person they're killing isn't a person. They're less than a person. You dehumanize them to the point that it does not matter what you do to them. So that's sort of what, on a large scale, what happens with the attitude towards indigenous peoples in America. They don't matter. They're just a cartoon. They don't exist anymore. They're in the past. They were villains. They deserved it. Whatever. Who doesn't
like Gophers?
It's weird that some of the stuff in the late 60s, like Go Gophers and F Troop, those shows came to the air at the same time that that so many indigenous protest movements were on the front pages, the fish-ins and then the AIM movement. And these were on TV at the same time that there were documentaries being made that were pillaring, the Stephen Fetchits of the 30s and the Hattie McDaniels, like they were being, put down by the Black Power movement. At the same time, the AIM movement is rising, and yet shows like F Troop and Go Gophers, and there was a Custer television series that ABC started broadcasting at the time. So there was this sort of tug of war, but for, again, I'm saying it over and over, but it was easier for Hollywood to ignore indigenous concerns than pretty much any other minority. They had the smallest numbers. They had the least amount of clout. They didn't have a large lobbying arm in Hollywood. And so things didn't catch.
I think they didn't have the consumer power. Like it seemed like if they were like, well, hey, the indigenous people are going to boycott the advertisers, they were like, we don't give a shit.
That's absolutely true. I mean, you look at the controversy over Amos and Andy, 750,000 signatures, African Americans signed a petition to get Amos and Andy, the radio show, removed from the air in the year 1931. The show went on the air in 1929. So right away, it's controversial. These two white guys doing blackface voices over the radio becomes a huge sitcom success. It was actually not so much a sitcom as a soap opera when it started. It was a 15-minute, 5-day-a-week serialized show with a cliffhanger at the end of every episode, which is why it became the most popular show. It was like a comic strip in a newspaper. You had to tune in the next episode to find out what happened. And so right from when it starts, it's controversial in the Black community, but it is not taken seriously. The petition, even though it almost had 1 million signatures, it's not taken seriously. And the main reason, in 1931, the Great Depression, African Americans have very little purchasing power. They're not a major demographic for a lot of the advertisers. I mean, they are, but not in the numbers that a boycott would really affect, whoever it was, the Pepsodent company or whoever was sponsoring Amos and Andy. That changed in the post-war period. After World War II, and many African-American servicemen are returning as heroes, there builds a strong Black middle class. Certain companies like Coca-Cola or General Motors were actively hiring and employing large numbers of African Americans. And for the first time, maybe in history, there's a Black middle class that one man working a full-time job can support a wife, 2 kids, own a house, own a car. And so suddenly Black purchasing power has clout. So when Amos and Andy comes to TV in 1952 and the NAACP objects, after a season and a half, now these protests and objections have a lot more traction. And that continued to be the case into the late 60s as more stereotypes, Black stereotypes, were removed from the air. Threats of boycott had more power, and a sponsor would shake in their boots more and more. Although, to be honest, the reason the Amos and Andy TV show was canceled was not really because people thought it was racist, but because it carried the stigma of being called Amos and Andy. It was really canceled more or less because of the protest that happened
Branding.
20 years earlier.
Yeah. It's fascinating. And mentioning the new show that Taika Waititi is producing, I think, from Jojo Rabbit, that reminds me, like, obviously the book is focusing on the Americas, because you do touch on something I didn't know about till the last couple of years, which is the boarding schools in Canada, where they basically stole Indigenous children and tried to like civilize them in horrific ways. And it's right up there for me with the Tulsa massacre, which I also didn't know about till Watchmen, which I'll admit, embarrassingly so.
I would watch Sopranos all the time, and
I've never watched The Sopranos.
oh my God, it's growing up, the whole mob thing for me, it's always been fascinating. Goodfellas and The Godfather, and I remember this time I met he was actually a native guy. I met him, and he was in the mob, and I was partying hard that night, so it was really a blur what he was
like
all
the
telling me.
Italian mafia, like the La Cosa
He was an
Nostra?
Italian, he was in somewhere as a native. I don't know what, I never got that far because I was having a little too much fun that night.
I hear you.
That was awesome. He had that look and everything, the suit, and like, man, I wanted to get them, know more, but I was already having way too much fun that night. But I always remember that.
Are you fascinated with that because it's so exotic?
I think so. Yeah. Because, growing up, we have a lot of tough guys where I come from. And it would be, I suppose it's more like a uncle type thing that would tough. We look forward to, or we look to the uncles to be tough and, protect the family. That's probably what it is. The whole family aspect of, being in the mob, and, you never rat out your friends. You keep your mouth shut, and, sometimes now that I'm older, I realize maybe we shouldn't keep our mouth shut.
All the time.
Not all the time.
Yeah.
When I went to college, I learned a lot about residential schools and, the government taking native kids from the homes and, forcing Christianity on them. And I think a lot of my grandparents never spoke of that because I don't know, even my mom, she doesn't really share if my grandparents talked about that on either side. And it's more like the more movies I see, the more books I read, people were ashamed to even, discuss what happened. And then for years, all those native kids had their traditions beat out of them. They weren't allowed to speak their language. And I think with a lot of my elders growing up, the same way, I didn't grow up very traditional. I think maybe that's why, because I'm still trying to learn my language, and I'm not into ceremonies and all that because I never saw that growing up. And
Right.
I think I just realized, going to college, that's probably why I was never really, really into that. So, and then with him watching TV, probably the same thing, he wanted something to, make it look like, probably whitewashing, it just entertained him and stuff like that. He's the one that got me into wrestling and Cubs baseball and all that stuff. And we didn't really discuss any traditional, nothing really, I just, I never thought about it like that until I went to college. I see a lot of the young people now are starting to, get into the language and ceremonies and, singing and all that stuff and trying to pass it on to the younger generation. So it's like it's coming back, now that we understand what happened to our elders and, with all them kids being taken out of the home forcibly and a lot of our land a lot of our rights taken away. And it just, we're understanding, we're educating ourselves. It's again, we're gonna come back strong, and we're gonna let our stories be known, and that's where we're going right now.
But I wonder how other countries fare with some of this stuff. And Taika's from New Zealand, and New Zealand, Australia, that part of the world has its own indigenous.
There's lots of countries in the world, but there really were only 5 major colonizers. Imperial powers who were quote unquote exploring in the name of the Pope or the King, depending on where you came from. It was Spain, France, England, Portugal, and the Dutch. Those are the colonizers. And you can think of examples in the United States, whether it's the Dutch in New York, in
Pennsylvania.
Canada is quote unquote settled by the French on one side, the British on the other side. And, the reason anybody speaks Spanish in Mexico is because the Spaniards enslaved the indigenous population and forced them to learn Spanish. The same way in Canada, in the East, they forced indigenous people to learn French, and in the West forced them to learn English. And if they refused or were resistant, they were beaten, they were murdered, what have you. So none of these countries fares up any better. New Zealand is another British colony. Australia is another British colony. South America was largely a Spanish colony. Parts of the United States were split up amongst these different colonizers. All of them, quote unquote, explored in the name of something called the doctrine of discovery. And every person, no matter who you are, should look into and learn a little bit about what the doctrine of discovery was, because it is sort of tantamount, in my opinion, to understanding all American history, all Canadian history, all world history. The doctrine of discovery was invoked in the 15th century. It was a papal order, and it stated, and I'm going to give the most basic, simplified version I can, but it is accurate. Doctrine of discovery stated that if you, as an explorer for one of those 5 host countries, arrived on a land, even if it was already inhabited by 10 million people, if none of them were Christians, they automatically lost title to the land, and the rights to that land, the ownership of that land, automatically reverted to the host country of the explorer who landed there. That is how Canada, to this day, claims their title to the wealth of the land, whether it's timber, oil, gas. There weren't treaties in Canada. They just said doctrine of discovery.
Not white, it's ours.
Yeah. And right up until 2007 or 8, whenever there was a dispute in the courts over land title, the Canadian government said, we've given a certificate to this oil company. They're going to build a pipeline from here to here. And Indigenous communities would say, no, we don't consent. Canada would say, well, tough shit. We don't need your consent. Doctrine of discovery says we own everything.
Right.
So they were still using that as a defense in court right up until like 10, 12 years ago, until the United Nations declared it illegal, like an illegal law. You can't use the doctrine of discovery as a defense anymore. It's as archaic and racist as the slave codes of old times. So still very controversial But there was a thing called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is shortened to UNDRIP. And UNDRIP is the document that says, okay, doctrine of discovery no longer applies. It can't. But if it no longer applies, then it throws everything into flux.
Right.
So when
we
that
give it
was
back.
when that was ratified in the UN, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States refused to sign on, but everybody
Of course.
else.
Yeah, it's in that sort of evolved into the uniquely American thing of manifest destiny, where they were like, well, we don't have a home country, so we're going to believe our new country that we founded has the same right to sort of just continue to expand. And, we're helping them by bringing them into this, under this tent. And it is enraging how it's still there. It shouldn't still be there.
Well, the Declaration of Independence did not apply to Native peoples until 1968. Like literally, did I say Declaration of Independence? Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights did not apply to Indigenous peoples until 1968. In the Bill of Rights, they refer to Indian savages, quote unquote, 3 times in the document. Like if you read it, it's what it says. Charlie Hill, who was a comedian I talk about in the book, who did the Richard Pryor show, and Carson, he joked that you would think they would at least change it to Native American savages. That was
because it's astounding to me that you can assume. How would I put this? Like, yeah, you just build into your culture that these are less than you, and perpetuate that into a quote unquote enlightened time is crazy. And even to this day, like if you look at Guam or even Puerto Rico or something like that, which they're US citizens, they live in a territory that's part of the US, but don't have the rights of US citizens or all of the rights.
Yeah. But and why are they US territories? Because they were colonized. They were into in war, and for years there were Puerto Rican independence movements. I think in the 70s, there were a lot of bombs set off around the United States in the name of Puerto Rican independence away from the United States. So all of these, when you read the history of all this shit, why people were denied voting rights, why people were granted voting rights. There's always sort of ulterior motives. We talk about, I live in California, and you often hear, well, this used to be Mexico, and racists are like, speak English. And it's like, well, people were speaking Spanish here before, but at the same time, people were speaking Spanish because they were colonized and enslaved by the Spaniards. And when you read the history of the Mexican-American War and in 1848, why California became America, why Texas became part of America, it was waged in the name of expanding slavery and expanding the seats in Congress, the slave owner states, because they would have the balance of power in Congress and in the Senate if they had Texas, if they had other things they laid claim to during the Mexican War. Almost every piece of American history, maybe all of history, it comes back to some sort of racist greed.
You're what, probably 4 or 5 hours away from
Minneapolis.
Yeah. Or any, is that the biggest major city near you?
Yeah. Minneapolis is the biggest. We got Fargo or Duluth, which is at least 3 hours away. And we're pretty secluded up here. And
have you watched the Fargo TV series?
I love that. The thing about that, the first season, it was based in the city that's, town 30 miles south of us. And the thing about that area, there's 3 Ojibwe tribes within, that support that. There was no Ojibwe in that series. That's what I was excited for.
Yeah.
I'm like, there's got to be at least a couple natives, and like there was a nurse, and that was it. There was no representation. I don't know where that Noah Hawley got his, vision of Bemidji from, but it wasn't actually what Bemidji is really like. And so I was really disappointed in that. So.
Is there anything you've watched that you felt was a good representation?
As I got older, there's a movie called Smoke Signals with Adam Beach. And I think that was probably the first time I've seen anything that resembled a Native community. And I was 22 when that came out. So it was really other than that, it was, Thunderheart, maybe. It was a good depiction of actual reservation and how hard it was growing up on a reservation. And, it was really rare for movies and TV to capture what it was really like for us growing up. It just, but since then, books are coming out. Like I have this book here. What is it? It's a graphic novel. It's called Scalped. It's by Jason Aaron. It was actually optioned for they filmed a pilot for it. The first episode was done, and then WGN dropped it after. Like, man, that would have been. It's kind of like a Sopranos type story, and I think they missed out on a big opportunity. So hopefully, with what's going on, the rise of native entertainment, they get back to that, because that's a really great story about how the corruption happens with casinos and the drug epidemic hurting our people. It's really what being on the res is all about. So,
which is pretty heavy, not funny stuff.
Yeah,
but those of us who do comedy know that comedy tends to be our the way we break, or the way that we keep from breaking, going through a tough situation. And it must be hard to present the comedic piece when even that first step of presenting the how hard it is piece isn't even widely known or done well.
Yeah. That's the thing about, I think it's just how we cope, I wouldn't say I had a rough life, but there are some things that I saw that I had no business seeing or experiencing, but it's just one of the things that made me what I am today. I really don't know what I am right now, but I just like to have fun and just play off. I suppose they always talk about humor is medicine for us. It's how we cope with all things tragic or misfortune that happens. It's just how we cope. Funerals are a big thing for us. Visiting with family and friends, it brings up the stories of whoever passed away, and it's just those stories, and getting everybody together is what helps us cope with loss. And it's just one of the things that unfortunately it's what we're really good at, sharing our humor because of all of our horrible experiences that we experience.
Yeah, but do you have, when you're in front of audiences, do you have difficulty connecting with people on that level who aren't who don't know what that was like? Do you feel like you have to set the stage a little bit first, or can you just kind of dive in?
I usually just dive right in, man. It's one of the things, one of the rare moments that I have total control of everything in my life. And that's what comedy is for me. Daily, it's my life is chaotic. I got the kids, I got work, and, make sure everybody's fed and bathed and clothed. But just that, it's like my outlet, getting on stage is just my time to let loose, whatever, I don't think about, the politics or the things I've gone through. Is just my time I own you. So you're going to hear what I have to say. And it's just my time,
No, I mean, that's 100%. Like, so I had a newspaper guy once sum up my act in that Ken likes to create creative, chaotic situations he can be in control of on stage. And I'm like, yeah, pretty much. But it is that you're sort of, when people ask me about what I like about stand-up, they're like, you must love getting the laughs. I'm like, not really. Like, it's kind of, this sounds evil, but being in control of a room full of strangers and making them react the way you want them to is very satisfying.
It really is. It's the rush, man. It's having, I know the crowd, if you get them just right, you can actually feel that energy, it hits you. It's like a rush. Yeah. I compare it to, Hulk Hogan, WrestleMania 3, when he got all
You started
all
doing
them
the
people.
shaking?
Yeah, you started hulking up, man. That's how I come. That's what I think of comedy. You know, once you hit them first few laughs, you just keep going and getting that energy back. It just makes me. It's like growing up. I was kind of I suppose a goofball hellraiser. You know, I'd get going and people say, don't encourage him. Don't encourage him. You know, he's going to, that's just what the crowd does to me. They encourage me and I keep trying to make them laugh more. And that's just what I love about comedy, man.
Oh yeah. Even like the Japanese and the Chinese, the Greeks and the Romans, like it's all kind of falls into that category. The joke I used to make on stage, which was not popular around here, was, I forget how I worded it, 'cause I've technically been on hiatus as a stand-up for like over a year, is that you have guys sitting on the front step of the North End, which is our little Italy, complaining about people not assimilating.
Right.
And I'm like, Mamma mia, these people from Somalia aren't becoming American. And it's
Right,
like,
right.
Your house is painted red, white, and green right now, and you have a Luigi mustache, and you're talking, but that's kind of, you always push the people down behind you. Did Charlie Hill wrote for Roseanne for a bit, didn't he?
Yeah, Charlie Hill, who was the first Native American stand-up comedian to do network television. The Richard Pryor Show in 77, Johnny Carson's Tonight Show in 78, did the Merv Griffin Show several times in the early 80s, did Late Night with David Letterman in 85. I think he did Arsenio Hall in 90 or 91. And got hired as a writer on Roseanne around the same time, 91 or so. A bunch of his old Comedy Store buddies were working there. A guy named Alan Steven, who never really became famous, but was always at the Comedy Store, I think got him that job. Rich Scheidner, the comedian.
Yep.
Also,
Lois Bromfield was there.
Yeah, so he knew a lot of those people. And in the early 80s, when Charlie Hill was really hot, he did the Comedy Works in Denver. And the woman who was opening for him was a local, and it was Roseanne. So they always knew each other, and she loved him. And so when they hired him, I think he really was in need of money. The comedy boom had just collapsed, and a lot of his work was lost. He had been a regular at the Comedy Store at the Dunes in Las Vegas. But as the comedy boom imploded, that venue shut down. And so he lost a big source of his income. And so to make up for that, he was hired as a writer at Roseanne. I think initially he was just hired for one episode, and then they put him on staff for a year or two in the early 90s. Yeah.
Because I don't think he wrote this episode, but there's a Thanksgiving episode of Roseanne.
He's in that episode. I think he wrote some of it because there's some lines in it that are straight out of his stand-up act. But that's the one where they do like a Thanksgiving play that's based on Pulp Fiction or something like that.
Yeah, it's like the real Thanksgiving to show that, this was not how it went down. And it's funny and it makes its point, but it's also a very special episode. Yeah. It's like that's the only way you'll get it in there is if you do it this way. Right. But nothing was showing that kind of thing on TV at the time. I can't think of another example.
That's common here. I never really thought of it till I moved to the States because I don't care about Thanksgiving. Like it's not an important holiday in Canada. It's on a different day or
in October or something, right?
Yeah. And I never know when it is. It's one of those holidays where it's like, it's the 5th Thursday of every, what? Like I don't.
Oh, it's late this year.
Yeah. Like I never understand that Easter, Thanksgiving. I never know when they are. But in Canada, there's no like correlation between Thanksgiving and First Nations peoples. They're not connected in some sort of lore. Whereas in the United States, it's part of the stereotype is this. I don't even know what the stereotype is, honest. I didn't learn it in school. There's something about pilgrims having dinner and inviting people over.
Well, the pilgrims, let me educate you, Kliph. The pilgrims came here because they needed religious freedom. And the first year they were here, it was harsh winter. They're white people from England. It's difficult. But the Native Americans came to them and showed them how to grow food and what to eat. And so they had a big meal together to thank them for helping them to survive that harsh year.
Really? That's the story? Wow.
Yep. Totally accurate. Historically accurate. I think we all can agree there. It's, it is, I'm pretty progressive and aware of stuff. And these are statements I sound like an idiot saying, but I was shocked to learn stuff from your book, or be reminded of stuff, or even just have stuff I knew but didn't think about that much.
Right.
Get really like, yeah, what the hell? And I think in a good way, and I think other people would get that out of the book. I imagine you're probably getting that reaction a lot.
Well, I know that it's a book about comedy, and then you read about it and it's like people being abused. I shouldn't laugh, but I mean, it's like
that's why you have comedy.
there's some seriously harsh sucker punches if you're just expecting, just another book about comedy, because there's a lot of history of colonization and, how people were dehumanized and why it has taken so long to come above those clouds that, encroached upon American society and forever. I don't know. The book just came out, so the feedback I've gotten, I don't know how many people finish a book. I can tell sometimes when I do these interviews, I'm like, the person read the first 20 pages, because all the questions are about the first 20 pages. They're not
right.
talking about anything else, or they're speaking in a very general way. But yeah, there's some harsh, cold, hard facts in the book. And I took it as my opportunity to try and hip my fellow non-natives to the reality of certain things. Why is it not okay to showcase stereotypes in the year 2021? And if blackface is unacceptable, why is it acceptable for a white actor to slather on red paint and continue to perpetuate stereotypes? Obviously, it's not. But
yeah,
that just sometimes doesn't track in the American mind.
You need to have it pointed out that way. Or there's like obviously from Massachusetts, so Elizabeth Warren had a whole controversy because she, but the sort of right-wing people would go up to her and do all manner of quote unquote, Indian hand gestures or sounds or whatever. And when you would say to them, like, that is racist, they go, why? She's not Indian. That's the point. And you're like, no, you can't.
And the weird irony is that, both of it is racist. So they're perpetuating these racist stereotypes. A white person claiming to be Native American is racist. White liberals defending her also were like doing so from a very wrong-headed, ill-informed, ignorant point of view.
Yeah.
Both are wrongs. I would see Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump debate that. And I was like, you got two people debating something that belongs to neither of them.
Right.
Neither of them are Cherokee. Neither of them are Native American. It doesn't matter that one has progressive policies and one has right-wing policies. They're both coming from the wrong angle, any way you look at it, regardless of politics. And sometimes if you're left of center, I see people like forgiving things. It happened in Canada. Justin Trudeau got busted for doing blackface 3 fucking times.
How? I just want to say, I grew up in Boston.
In the 2000s, he did.
Yeah, and I literally have never met anyone who did blackface. It never even would have occurred to me. The joke I make is like, didn't you all see that Give Me a Break episode in 1982 to teach you this is wrong? But it's one of those things that like, even the most racist townie asshole here, if someone showed up in blackface, they'd be like, dude, that's fucking wrong. I'm going to kick your fucking ass. Like, even that. And then it was like person after person. I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah. Yeah. People in Canada defended Justin Trudeau because they felt that, the alternative was, a far right leader. So we'd rather have this sort of quasi-liberal guy in blackface and would defend it or apologize for it or excuse it. And they'd be like, he already apologized. I go, it was like, wasn't it 2006 that he was?
Yeah.
He's like fucking crazy. I mean, the only reason that guy is the Prime Minister of Canada is because his dad is a famous name. So it was like, we'll nominate him because they had a different guy who was really lost the election for them. They had no leader. So they went with name recognition. And it works, really. In the States, people love him because he wasn't Trump and he had cute socks. They thought he was good looking.
Yeah.
So the blackface thing was sort of like forgiven. Imagine if Trump had done blackface. I'm not defending Donald Trump, but imagine if he had done blackface. You'd never hear the end of it. But with Justin Trudeau, somehow now it's almost like it's just a piece of trivia.
Well, we like him. Yeah, it's, and not to go down a Trump rabbit hole, because I will, but when a lot of people were like, oh, all of a sudden he's president, now everyone's saying he's racist. He was never racist before. And I'm like, hey, here's some footage from 1994 of him testifying before Congress, complaining about casinos, saying, quote unquote, those people don't look Indian to me.
Yeah.
Like, what? Like, yeah, that's racist.
Yeah.
It's consistent. But since it is also about comedy, how will I word this where it won't sound offensive to the comedians, but like, did you find any of the humor you discovered to be truly funny, or was it sort of alien to you culturally? Like you would get why it was funny, but did you think it was funny?
I think people misunderstand what the premise of this book is, because it's comedy is comedy.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no one style of comedy. So, what is native comedy? It's a native person doing comedy. So There's Howie Miller, who does impressions. There's the 1491s, who are a sketch troupe. There's people that do political commentary, who do hack material, who talk about their personal life. There's a guy in the book named Von Eaglebear. You can go on YouTube and listen to a cut from his comedy record, Von Eaglebear Powwow Comedy Jam, and he sort of sounds like Mitch Hedberg. So there's all these different styles of comedy, and like any other realm of comedy, some strikes you as super funny, some is not for you. It's the same as any other faction of comedy. There wasn't anything that was particularly alienating, but it wouldn't be any different than me hearing a white girl talk about
pumpkin spice lattes.
Or maybe like a gay comic talking about being gay. I'm not gay, but I'm not alienated by listening to the material. I can relate to some of it. Some of it might strike me as funnier if I can relate to it. But no, there was nothing particularly mystifying in this book. I mean, there's so many different styles, so.
Because the 1491s, is that their name? Because their stuff strikes me as almost like Mr. Showy sometimes, or like it's much. But was there anything that you discovered in researching this book that you're like, this is lost gold? Like, why isn't this in the pantheon of classic comedy that, or anything that was overlooked that you're like, people should check this out?
I don't know about lost gold, but I would say that Charlie Hill has never really gotten his proper due in the history canon. They just did a documentary about the Comedy Store on Showtime, and they didn't mention his name, but he was a fixture at the Comedy Store from late 1974 right up until like 2000. I don't know what year he moved back to Wisconsin, but like 2006 or 7. Like, he was a Comedy Store comedian that entire time, 30 years, constantly seen in photos wearing a Comedy Store shirt. He was a good friend and contemporary of David Letterman, Jay Leno, Jimmy Walker, Robin Williams, Michael Keaton. That was his crew. And yet he's sort of obscured. And again, it's such a strange thing, because we celebrate firsts or early people, early figures who'd done things early on who belong to a certain minority group. So you'd celebrate the first Black comedian to do such and such, or the first Latino comic to do such and such. Charlie Hill, you never hear in non-native circles the first Native American comedian to do primetime TV, to do late night TV, to do Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. You would think that would be like a famous thing, celebrated, regardless of subgroup. White people would celebrate that, perhaps, if they knew it. It just is strange to me that this historic figure really is not treated as such. He is treated as a legend and a hero, Charlie Hill, in indigenous communities all across North America. But in non-native circles, he's ultimately overlooked or unknown. And that's a shame. So he was sort of the one where I was like, well, this guy should be well known by all comedy fans because he's important to the history. He is the first guy to do something of significance here. And all these years later, there has never been another Native American comedian to perform on The Tonight Show.
What was the seed of the book? Was it something like that you stumbled on doing other things, or was this something you always kind of wanted to explore?
No, I knew of this sort of renaissance of Indigenous comedy that was going on. The seed was me coming from Canada, where First Nations issues were prominent in the media. and coming to Los Angeles, where they were all but absent.
Just doesn't cut. Yeah.
It just seems so weird to me. If you look at CBC or Globe and Mail or any major Canadian news site, on the tabs at the top of the screen, it'll be like world news, sports, business, Indigenous. There's always an Indigenous tab for Indigenous news items. That does not exist at the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN. I don't know if they employ any Native journalists. I have no idea. I know CBC has at least 100. So there's a big difference there. And Canada, if you read this book, you'll be perfectly clear, their history with Indigenous peoples is not better.
Horrific.
No, it's not better. It's arguably worse, at least just as bad as the United States. So I'm not saying that it's better there, but there's a little bit more awareness today in the current generation about First Nations issues and about First Nations representation, which is absent in America. So in writing this book, I felt like I could bring some of that know-how coming from Canada and sort of examining it and showing how bizarre or unacceptable that sort of divide is. I feel like I could present that in a meaningful way. And even though this book is for the American market, I was intent on putting a lot of Canadian history in there too, just to school Americans that Canada is not the utopia necessarily that you perceive it to be.
Yeah, which I think would be shocking for a lot of people, especially Americans, where they think about that. And I know it was for me when I had heard about it. I'd heard about the schools before this book, but you really paint a picture of them in a way that I had not seen before. And, to your point, the importance of representation with Charlie Hill, who, again, most people probably haven't heard of necessarily who aren't Indigenous, but almost everybody you talk to in the book, especially the sort of modern comedians, mention seeing, if not him, someone else on TV, and it being a light bulb moment of like, oh, we can do that? We're allowed to do that? That's an option? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, you can see examples of that all throughout history. Black politicians inspire other people to run for political office, or Freddie Prinze in stand-up, or a Richard Pryor in stand-up, or an Eddie Murphy in stand-up. This sort of cause and effect of representation, seeing your own experience reflected back to you when you're young, inspiring you to follow a similar path. And Charlie Hill, and there's a Canadian stand-up special called Welcome to Turtle Island, which I mentioned in the book as well, which featured a First Nations comedian named Craig Lozon, who inspired 3 other First Nations comics to get into stand-up, at least 3 others, maybe more, because for a lot of these young comics, he was the first Native comedian they had seen on TV. So representation has a cause and effect. There's a real clear cause and effect and strong argument to be made for the importance of minority representation, because when minorities are allowed to represent themselves on the screen, they're going to convey a more honest and respectful and legitimate portrayal than, obviously, it goes without saying, than if a non-member of that minority group attempts to do the same thing, or ignores it altogether. So.
Yeah, and even like the people that it inspires, like we were talking about before, the stuff that we grew up on, which would be considered maybe hacky or cliche now, the people inspired by that did totally different kinds of comedy. And it's the same thing here. They're not necessarily going up and doing a Charlie Hill-like act. It's totally different in a lot of ways. It's just the image of somebody like them doing it at all.
Yeah, and this is true of all subjects. Sports, same thing. Jackie Robinson probably inspired hundreds, if not thousands of kids to get into playing ball. Same with kids in Latin America who see somebody make it big in the major leagues, inspires them, so of course.
My favorite story in the book, Elaine Miles, the actress from Northern Exposure, I loved on Northern Exposure. Like, she is the highlight of that show and a completely breakout character. And although I think falls into a little bit of the cliche stuff we were talking about as sort of the sage one, kind of a character we'd never seen on TV before that. And she sort of gives him shit. She's sort of sassy, but also like really deadpan and just hilarious and likable. And I I loved that story in the book because I forgot a little bit of how much I loved her.
Yeah, I never really watched much of the show, but she herself, she is really funny, and I think it's a lot of her that comes through on that program. She is sort of this sardonic, deadpan. Has a very some people are just funny, they're just naturally funny, and the way she speaks is just naturally funny. She's got sort of a no bullshit, sort of sarcastic, but also like
sweet though too.
You can sort of just when I'll put you in contact with her. When you talk to her on the phone, you just sort of can tell that her mouth is probably half smiling with everything she says. It's serious, but at the same time, there's this undercurrent of I'm pulling your leg to it. And she was just a natural comic performer, which is why she was so successful on that show.
And it really made me realize how absent to where we started with this sort of not cliche portrayals of Native people are in shows, in that character's not necessarily cutting edge or groundbreaking in theory, but is in a way that it's because it's presented so normal.
Oh yeah, that's a revolutionary thing in America, to present an indigenous person as just an everyday human being. That's a revolutionary act.
When my oldest was born, she's a girl. She was a girl. She's 25 now, but I used to just buy her Air Jordans, basketball jerseys, and wrestling men. And my wife said, she's a girl, right? So, well,
sure, for now.
Yeah, for now, we still have pictures of her in her Jordan jersey and Jordan shoes and Larry Johnson jersey.
How grandmama.
Yeah. But, then 10 years later, I finally had my first son, and he got to get all that cool stuff. And
is there anything you show your kids? Like, obviously, we discussed Eddie Murphy, how that would not be appropriate. But is there anything you watched growing up that you have shown them that just to see that they don't think is a weird old man show?
Well, Seinfeld is the main thing. I watched that. I know it was on TBS just about every day. I'd watch it every day, for years. And, that's what my kids know me for, watching Seinfeld all the time. And that's pretty much it. Otherwise, the G.I. Joe movies with The Rock, and my son was into that. And once he started getting into that, then they quit making G.I. Joe toys. I was like, what? Why would, why? I grew up playing with G.I. Joe toys, wrestling men, and
refrigerator Perry toy. Did you have the refrigerator Perry?
It took me forever to get that. I got 2 of them.
Oh man.
I was fortunate. My grandpa helped me get those, and I was like, refrigerator Perry. That's really old school there, man.
The mail-in Sergeant Slaughter. That was a hard one to get.
Yeah, those good ones, man. I remember I had all my G.I. Joe men until I was 14 years old, and I just did not want to part with them. And I had about three of them left when I was in my 30s. So I don't know what happened to them. They got lost in the moves, and
they went off on their own. They went to the big city.
Went off on their own lives, having their own families and stuff. And
refrigerator Perry's doing really well. He's living in Minneapolis. He's got a band.
Right. It's ridiculous, but it's true. And only now, maybe this year,
right,
are we seeing any of that change anyway. So yeah, it's a wild thing.
Well, you've done more than your part. I love the book, and I'll plug it in the intro outro. Do you have a preference where people buy it?
No.
Okay. Some people do. I always ask. Are you working on the next one yet?
Yeah, I haven't signed the contract, but it's about 99% done. Not the book, but the deal. And I'm jinxing it right now by mentioning it. Yeah. It's going to be sort of the more books that I publish in the coming years, I think it'll become more obvious to my readership, the overreaching theme. They're all going to click into place like a puzzle. For a lot of people, the premise of this book seems far afield from the last book. And a lot of people who enjoyed the first book, I can sense, are reluctant to even pick up this book because to them, it just doesn't register what it is about. But the next book, I think things will start to fall in place a little bit more, people understanding. The next book is going to be about sort of an extension of that protest movement I was talking about with Amos and Andy and the 1911 contingent of Indigenous leaders. It's going to be a history of show business, specifically the history of racism and anti-racism, starting with minstrel shows in the 1830s, right up to Andrew Dice Clay and beyond. And the conceit being that in this social media era, we keep hearing about, well, people didn't complain in the past. People are too sensitive now. This is unprecedented. This never happened before.
Right. Everyone was cool with it.
But that's not the case. And that exact same argument that had never happened before and people need to lighten up is the argument that I've discovered with my research in the year 1904, when there was a push to remove blackface from vaudeville. And editorial writers were saying, if you get rid of blackface, we'll say goodbye to comedy. You know,
Yeah.
people better get a sense of humor. That's the whole basis of show business. And we've lost our sense of humor as Americans, and people are too sensitive today in 1904. So that's what the new book is sort of going to be about. It's going to be story after story after story of minority protest movements and this push and pull in the culture war, whether it's song lyrics, whether it's dances like the twist, or jazz music, or rock and roll, or stereotypes in the movies, whether it's Chinatown tropes or what have you. It's going to be a huge in scope book dealing with the so-called culture wars throughout the history of show business.
I love that. And yeah, even for me, when I saw the title of the book, the new book, I was like, oh, that's an interesting choice. But then when I read it, I'm like, oh no, this fits perfect. This makes total sense.
Yeah, it's the same vibe as my previous work. And it is, I talk about hee-haw in this, the history of hee-haw. You wouldn't think that a book about indigenous comedy would be telling you the history of hee-haw, but one of the only Native American comedians on TV in the 1980s was this guy, Terry Reid, who was in a comedy team called Williams and Reid. And he was the first, last, and only Native American cast member on Hee Haw. He was hired for the final 2 seasons of Hee Haw, in which they were trying to hip up the show to broaden their demographic, which was
the Nashville Network years.
Yeah. In fact, right here.
Oh, you get a hat there. Yeah.
Nashville Network ball cap up on the wall here.
Man.
But
Nashville Network. Oof.
The Nashville Network, but they were trying to hip up hee haw, so they got rid of the cornfield, and in an attempt to expand their viewership to like a younger demographic, they turned the cornfield into a shopping mall, and it would be Grandpa Jones on a bench in a shopping mall. Nothing is going to appeal to the teenagers more than a grandpa sitting on a bench. But they really thought that getting rid of the cornfield and replacing it with a shopping mall would bring in younger viewers to hee haw. Anyways, Terry Reid, who's in the book, was part of that cast. So if you like classic show business, if you like old movies, you like old TV shows, as many of your listeners do, you're going to get a lot out of this new book, which is called We Had a Little Real Estate Problem, The Unheralded Story of Native Americans in Comedy, available from Simon & Schuster now.
Thank you so much. Maybe in 5 more years, after the next one's out, we'll get together again, maybe in person, and we'll do this one more time, maybe in a restaurant.
I got to tell you, the last one that we did, the first one that we did, and please, listeners, do not listen to it because I use the R word in it, but it has the best atmosphere of any podcast I ever did. Like, it worked perfectly. It sounds like it's taking place in an old restaurant with dishes clanging, and it is. It really conveyed the atmosphere, audio, through audio of Musso and Frank really, really, really well. And I really enjoy that.
Because I know you got those kids running around. And
they're
God knows what they're up to.
I think they're holding their mother hostage now. It's pretty quiet up there. So.
Oh, so maybe that's good. Cool. Well, thank you so much for doing this. We'll have to do it again.
Yes, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Cool. There you go. That's Kliph and Jon. Great dudes. Great book. Check out NDN Way podcast with Johnny R, which is Jon's podcast. Buy Kliph's book. Buy his next book. His previous book. All the books. Buy all the books that exist in the world. If you would like to email me, you can do so at ken@icanread.com or tvguidancecounselor@gmail.com. I'm on social media at tvguidance and at kenfwread. We have a Patreon. You know the drill. You guys have heard it all before, and you'll hear it all before again next week when I have a brand new episode of TV Guidance Counselor.
I'm an entertainer. How dare you? You're trying to take a bite out of my livelihood. We never hurt anybody.